bit different from just introducing the next speaker. I'm going to interview him, and he doesn't know what I'm going to ask him. My name is Bob White. I'm director of the Faraday Institute, and we're really privileged to have the Reverend Professor David Wilkinson with us today. You did a PhD in theoretical astrophysics, and then you did a PhD in systematic theology, which sound like opposite ends of the world to me. So, why was this?
That's a very good question. In fact, the only thing that 2 doctorates has got me is an afternoon on local radio of doctor jokes. That's the height of my media career. But actually, I mean, the theology doctorate was reflecting on the end of the universe. The astrophysics doctorate was really more to do with how stars and galaxies form. So I suppose there was some kind of connection between them.
Right. And in between those two, you've got ordained. You're now head of a theological college in Durham. You've done work on the media in apologetics and so on. So tell me why you think it's worthwhile being head of a theological institute in Durham and what you're doing now.
One of the great things about the college that I'm at in Durham, which is at St John's College, is that it's right at the crossroads of church and academy. We train about 140 church leaders, mainly Anglicans, but alongside that, we have another 550 students who do all subjects across the university, and we offer Christian hospitality. And the great thing about it is that a 42-year-old who feels called to be an Anglican priest, having spent a morning doing Old Testament theology, has to sit down at lunch with an 18-year-old who spent the morning doing sociology, who has no sense what they're going to do with their lives, and thinks that Richard Dawkins is the greatest theologian who's ever lived. Now, at that point, that's an interesting conversation, both for the trainee priest and for the 18-year-old. And that's what excites me about the college that I'm in, is not to train folk in a kind of Christian bubble, but to train folk right at the edges of the kind of conversations that you have here.
Brilliant. Well, we look forward to hearing from you now on the beginning of that process as the university design. So over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed. It's a delight to be with you. It's always a thrill for me to come down and be part of this particular Faraday Summer School. And I've always got a sense of awe about it, both in terms of the other speakers and the expertise represented in the room. It's late in the afternoon, it's warm, and you've got 2 talks from me. I feel I need to apologise in advance because of that. Feel free to go to sleep if you'd like to. Lie down at the front. I've been in Christian meetings where that happens often, but it's rarely happened here. It's great to be with you. So 2 talks. The first is I'm going to talk about is the universe designed. The second is we're going to talk about aliens. When we come to the question of design, within the Christian world and within Christian tradition, the word design can be referred to, understood in lots of different ways. And certainly, when it goes outside the Christian tradition, and particularly ripples out into the media and in a world which still has traces of new atheism to it. So, Christian theology particularly, and forgive me, I'm going to be speaking from the background of Christian theology, that's all that really I know about. That's not to say that the only questions are Christian questions. There are going to be many other ways that we're going to come to this, but I'm going to speak from Christian theology. The way that Christian theology is perceived has an effect on how the science-religion debate is perceived. I'm going to show you a clip now from an Irish comedian called Dara O'Brien. This is part of his stand-up routine. For those of you who have not encountered this from different cultures, well, he pokes fun at his own background, which is Roman Catholicism, and he pokes fun from the point of view of being himself trained in science. He did a degree in physics. And this is symptomatic of a number of the comedians of today, other British comedians like Stephen Fry or Eddie Izzard or Ricky Gervais, who use comedy to poke fun at particularly design. Well, you know that type of scenario, and you've probably heard it in different ways, in different contexts. The pitting of science against faith, making fun of the Genesis literature, and indeed of that sense that the universe is designed. The design argument itself has a long history, and we don't have time to go into it in detail. But you remember some of the high points of it. Robert Boyle and the Boyle Lectures, the Bridgewater treatises, John Ray's thesis on a fly's eye, and how it shows that there is a design behind the universe. And of course the high point, William Paley's natural theology, and his image of walking across a heath and picking up a watch. There must be a maker, a designer of that watch. So Paley said, let me apply that to the biological world, and I see those same traces of design. There must be a designer. And often the way that this story is presented is that this is all about trying to prove the existence of God. And you'll remember that David Hume and Immanuel Kant made critiques of the design argument, very strong critiques of the design argument. They didn't affect William Paley very much. He continued, and indeed Cambridge University continued with the natural theology for a very long time. It was, of course, Charles Darwin who really sounded death knell of the design argument. Or did he? And is that really the story of the design argument? Now, I'm going off on a little historical tangent for a moment. And those of you who are interested in Big Bang cosmology, don't worry, I will get there eventually. But let me just go back into the 19th century to a particular hero of mine. And I've just been doing a little bit of research on this guy. And his story, I hope you will see, becomes relevant for how we interpret Big Bang cosmology and the design argument today. So can you stay with me just for 10 minutes or so? Is that all right? This is a man called Temple Chevalier, a very distinguished astronomer. He did quite a lot of work in the 19th century on sunspots. There's a crater on the moon named after him. He started his career, as many academics do, here at Cambridge University, but moved quickly to Durham University, where he was the first professor of astronomy, appointed by the university in 1841. By the way, he was also professor of mathematics, and also reader in Hebrew in the Department of Theology. He was a little, let's say, saddened that he wasn't given a chair in theology. He felt he deserved one, but nevertheless he had chairs in mathematics and astronomy. He was also registrar of the university. He was a local vicar in Esh Parish for over 30 years. He was rural dean and residential canon at the university. Obviously they didn't have television in those days, so he had lots of time to work. And Chevalier has some interesting parallels and some interesting resonances. He studied Paley while he was here at Cambridge. His dates are around about the time of Charles Darwin. He had a son who died, and Chevalier himself buried his son. You can see the grave in Esh Parish Church today. But what particularly interested me were these Halcyon lectures, which Chevalier gave in a period, the 1820s, 1830s here in Cambridge. And these Halcyon lectures were called On the Proofs of Divine Power and Wisdom, derived from the study of astronomy and the evidence, doctrine, and precepts of revealed religion. He did 20 lectures over this period of time, and they're based on Psalm 19. He begins in lectures 1 to 4 with the first 6 verses of Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. And there he talks about his astronomy. He talks about the universe. Then he moves on. I'm sorry about the time, but this is lectures 5 to 8, where he talks about the Bible, the Word of God. And then in lectures 9 to 12, he moves on to talk about the Christian life. And then lectures 13 to 20, he does what many of us do in lecture courses. He gets all of his old lectures and he pushes them in to fill up the space so that he can get to 20 lectures. They actually have nothing to do with his overall theme or Psalm 19, he just wants to fill up the time. Not that any of us have ever done that over the years in any way. Now, what's interesting about Chevalier in this period, as his Holstein lectures demonstrate, are three things. The first is an obvious point, you'll have heard it from others during this course, that Darwinian conflict was not the dominant narrative of the 19th century. Of course, Darwin himself is a much more complicated figure than that of simple conflict. What we have are those like Chevalier, who were very relaxed with evolution, and indeed were seeing science still as a gift from God, as a very positive thing to be celebrated. That narrative, that story is rarely told, of course, but is a very important part of the story. Secondly, to use the technical term, it was more about wow than proof. His use of astronomy under the title Proofs of the Divine Power was not at all about logical proofs. His approach was to say, look at the universe. Isn't it amazing? How does it make you feel? Not, let me logically demonstrate to you the existence of a designer. We'll come back to that. But for what it's worth, I would suggest that much of the design argument as we see it is actually more about the wow than the logical proof. And the third thing, which is use of Psalm 19, is very important to understand, is that for Chevalier, natural theology, what I can tell about God in the natural world, has to be structured, understood, framed by this God who reveals himself to us. So that for Chevalier and others, the design argument wasn't the way that sometimes the history textbooks say that it was, that you try and prove God without any reference to revelation. For Chevalier and others in the 19th century, still post-Paley, natural theology had to be understood, interpreted from the framework of revealed theology, of God who reveals himself in history and experience for Christians supremely in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, that was my little historical wandering. Let me therefore now come to what's going on in the universe today, and just see if you find any resonances between that and this. So what might we say in terms of the universe of today? What might there be which suggests, if not there is a designer, at least the heavens declare the glory of God? And the first is this: the universe is big. Now you might be sitting there thinking, why have they brought this bloke all the way down from Durham to simply stand in front of us and say that the universe is big? I could have spent another hour in the sunshine outside rather than coming to a lecture about the universe is big. It is big, and that's not trivial. Just how big it is. And the vastness of the universe is part of this sense of awe that Ruth and others have picked up so eloquently in recent years. This is one of my favourite galaxies. It's UDFJ 39546-284. Astronomers have a lot of imagination in naming their galaxies at times. This is quite a small galaxy. A picture taken by the Hubble Space Telescope. It's called the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. And it's gazed at this little patch of sky, and eventually, after a time, you see this. It's a little galaxy. It's about 1,000 times smaller than the Milky Way. Way has about 100 billion stars or so. So it's not that small, but compared to galaxies, it's small. And what's interesting about this particular galaxy is it's one of the furthest objects we've ever seen in the universe. So the light from this galaxy has taken over 13 billion years to reach us. Just say that again. The light from this galaxy has taken over 13 billion years to reach us. The sunshine outside, the light from the sun has taken just a little over 8 minutes to reach Cambridge. Here, the light from this galaxy has taken 13 billion years. Now, the vastness of the universe is not trivial. It begins to pose the question, as the psalmist in Psalm 8 would say, when I look at the heavens, the moon, the stars, the work of your fingers, what are human beings that you're mindful of them? There is a question provoked by the simple sense of the vastness of the universe. In fact, of course, as we look out into the universe, we look back in time. And so this is the Hubble Ultra Deep Field from which that galaxy is part. And as you can see, as we look out, we look back in time because we see that galaxy as it was 13 billion years ago when the light set off. And so we're looking back in the history of the universe. And we're able to look back within 1 billion years of the Big Bang itself. Some people say, can we ever see right back to the Big Bang? Well, unfortunately, just around here, the universe is quite cloudy. You can't see through it, and we thought there might be little gravitational waves due to inflation down here, but it seems to actually be dust right about here rather than gravitational waves here, but that's another story. But even so, a universe of such age, of such vastness, poses the question, what are human beings in the midst of us? Now, design often, I think, works on the wow or on the question rather than the proof. The vastness of the universe is one of those. Sorry, you won't be able to see the slide at the back. My apologies for it being so small. But the James Webb Telescope, when it's launched at some point, we'll be able to see much further. Second, the universe is intelligible to us. Again, that might be very simple, but it's not trivial. The fact that the mathematics of our minds is able to understand the mathematics of the universe, I find this extraordinary. And of course, the Higgs boson is an extraordinary story. Not because of its theological interest, because it was called the God particle. I can't tell you when Higgs boson was discovered, how many radio stations phoned me up to ask me to comment on the God particle and its theological implications. Part of the reason it's called the God particle is that one of the early authors writing about the Higgs boson, because it's very difficult to see, called it that goddamn particle. The editor said, you can't call it a goddamn particle. Why don't you call it the God particle? And so the name stuck. Here's its announcement of discovery at the LHC by Ralph Hoyer, and in the Daily Mail, that great theological and scientific journal, was able to highlight its discovery. It was everywhere. Higgs particle is one of the ways that we imagine particles to have mass. Lots of illustrations have been used for how it works. My favourite one is Margaret Thatcher in a Commons tea room. I don't know if you've heard this, but when Mrs. Thatcher was Prime Minister at the time of when she was in office, if she walked through the House of Commons tea room, she would be immediately surrounded by lots of MPs. Being surrounded by lots of MPs, her movement became slower and slower and slower as they almost dragged her back as she walked through the tea room. So people said, Higgs particles are a bit like that. There is a field of Higgs particles, and they act as a kind of drag between master particles in the universe. And what the LHC attempted to do was to generate protons in one direction and then the other direction and smash them together, rather like taking two Margaret Thatchers and smashing them together at very high speed and looking for the MPs who were thrown off by this thing. And you designed detectors to detect the MPs as they're thrown off, the Higgs particles. Peter Higgs predicted that they would be thrown off at a particular energy, and this is a lovely plot. I can see you're excited by it. This is the discovery of the Higgs particle. And this little kink here was what Peter Higgs and others predicted. That's what we found. And at £9 billion, absolutely, £9 billion. Yes, cost for that little kink. Now that's another story, isn't it? We might talk about that later, whether it's worth it or not. But in terms of science, what a wonderful story. That actually, you can predict something, you can build something for £9 billion, you actually find that it's there. There is the sense of the way that theory and observation interact in such a wonderful way, but more importantly, that our laws of physics are intelligible, simple, elegant, beautiful, far more than we ever imagined. You see, the Higgs particle allows us at the moment to say that our standard model of particle physics is pretty good. Of course, as LHC cranks up more and more energies, people say, well, we might find more what's going on. But I suspect it will be even more simple, elegant, and beautiful, because that's our experience of science. There's no way of... no. Can we take it a bit more? Could we? This is a simulation done by some of my colleagues in Durham of the way the universe develops. What you're seeing here is intergalactic gas forming clusters of galaxies. The different colours are temperatures. So as the gas gets compressed, so it rises in temperature. And you start seeing these filaments, and you start seeing the structure, the large-scale structure of the universe beginning to emerge. And this is all done in a supercomputer in the basement of the Department of Physics in Durham University. We're inspired that actually we can begin to understand, perhaps not fully yet, but with a fairly good grasp of how structure forms in the universe. And now, we're going to look at a different length scale here. And again, we're looking at the way that structure begins to emerge in the universe. And this is a numerical simulation looking at how gravity shapes galaxies. What we've got here is a disk galaxy evolving. You can see other galaxies banging into it, other little lumps being thrown out from it, beginning to acquire a characteristic galaxy shape, and there it is, as we observe it to be. The simulation goes on, and you can see it on YouTube. It's a very beautiful thing. It even comes with music, which I brought with me today. And it's that sense of we can understand the nature of the universe. That's not a trivial thing. Or how about the Big Bang itself? Our current models of physics allow us to trace the history of the Big Bang back to 10 to the minus 43 of a second. And if you're not a mathematician, that's 1 divided by 10 followed by 42 zeroths of a second. At that point, our current laws of physics seem to break down. But for the rest of the time, they work pretty well, pretty beautiful. And we understand how quarks get together to form hydrogen and helium between 1 second and 1,000 second hydrogen helium, and the universe, little bits of deuterium, lithium, but nothing much to write home about. And we can understand a little bit of how these stars and galaxies form. Don't get me wrong, we haven't got it perfect, we haven't got the whole story. But this is an extraordinary achievement of science, to explore realms of physics that not even the Large Hadron Collider can touch in terms of its energies. Now the trouble with many Christians is the thing that interests us is, oh, loads of physics break down here. So, what about that question mark there? Let's insert God as the cause. The old God of the gaps type argument. But in doing so, we miss a far more fundamental interesting thing, which is that we can only understand these laws of physics because God has given us the gift of science. The intelligibility of the laws is a fascinating question. One of the people who works on that simulation that I've just shown you is not a religious believer in any way, but he says often to me, he says, why is it that the laws of physics are intelligible? Why should that be? It's a question, rather than, I think the answer is God, but it's a question which involves a conversation to happen. And so when Hawking comes along and says, well actually, don't use God of the gaps, because that first 10 to the minus 43 of a second, I think that M theory might provide an answer to fill in the first 10 to the minus 43 of a second, to fill in the scientific story. As a Christian, I'm not worried about that. Because for me, even if Professor Hawking uses quantum theory to tell us how that first minuscule of a second happens, I still have the question, where does quantum theory itself come from? Where do the laws of physics come from? The intelligibility of the laws of physics. Albert Einstein once said the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. Why should that be? Third, and you'll be saying to yourself, well, you'll eventually get to fine-tuning. So let me get to fine-tuning. Or as Paul Davis has, I think, eloquently put it, the Goldilocks enigma. Why are things just right to make possible carbon-based intelligent life? And of course, Davis is probably preeminent in this field, not a part of any religious faith community as such, but from his own work in cosmology, he wrote partly tongue-in-cheek, partly serious in 1983 in God and New Physics. In my opinion, science offers a surer path to God than religion. He has been interested, some would say obsessed, with the fine-tuning of the universe. Why the laws and circumstances of the universe are just right to make possible carbon-based intelligent life. Someone else who's been in this area was Sir Fred Hoyle. Sir Fred, in the 1960s, of course, was one of the people behind the steady-state theory of the universe, and in part motivated to avoid the theistic implications of the Big Bang model. Hoyle then worked, and should have got the Nobel Prize and didn't, on the way that atoms are cooked up in stars, how the heavier atoms, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, iron, and other things. And part of the story is that in the explosions of dead stars, a star like our sun will eventually run out of its hydrogen gas, it will start to burn helium, it will start to burn anything it can get its hands on, and if it's larger than our own sun, it will explode in a supernova explosion, like this one that left the Crab Nebula. Hoyle and others did work on how carbon is produced in these type of supernova explosions. And what he discovered was that this production of carbon has to be just right in terms of the energy levels of carbon and oxygen. In fact, if they differ by less than 2%, there would be no carbon in the universe. And that's quite serious for you and me, because we're made of this stuff. Hoyle wrote after that, nothing has shaken my atheism as much as this discovery. Now, he then went on in the 1980s to write a book called The Intelligent Universe. He never became a theist as such, maybe a pantheist. He talked about an intelligence behind the universe. But nevertheless, the fine-tuning question for him and for Paul Davies raises the question of, is there a deeper story to the universe? Martin Rees, a decade ago, also started to play around with this in a book called Just Six Numbers, where he identified 6 constants in the universe and said if these were just slightly different, then we would not be around. Now, he's a particular interesting case because he's then very honest about what the options are to interpret this. Option 1 is, it just is. Okay? It's fine-tuned because it just is, and we just stop asking the question. And there are those who say, well, that's the answer. It just is. Rees, in his book, repeats a lovely parable from the philosopher John Leslie, which goes something like this. Imagine, Leslie says, that you are sentenced to death in a firing squad, and you find yourself against a wall, and 50 people with rifles in front of you. They all take aim, they all discharge bullets towards you, and not one of those bullets hits you. They all impact the wall behind you. Well, in this parable, John Leslie says, there's a number of options to interpret that. You could simply say, I've been lucky this morning, and just walk away and get on with your life. Leslie says, actually, most of us would not be convinced by that. We would start asking the question, why? Maybe it was a mock execution. Maybe something was going on. Maybe there's some kind of freak magnetic effect going on. Maybe a lorry with a very large magnet just at the right moment going behind, or something like that. I mean, you begin asking, what is the deeper story to the universe? And so Rees, with others, is not content to simply say it just is, because some of these balances are so extraordinary, they lead you to the deeper story. Option 2, God did it. God is the one who makes things just right. He dismisses this fairly quickly as it happens, and goes on to his third option, which is the multiverse, which Rodney and others have talked about at great length. Forgive me, I'm just going to do a brief summary, if I may, just here. But this has become the sexy way to interpret the Goldilocks enigma today. And it seems to me that there are many multi-universe theories. 3 in particular, let me pick out for you. First is that old thing that the universe might expand, and then if there's enough mass in it, eventually the expansion will be reversed and it will contract back to the opposite of a Big Bang, Big Crunch. And then people in the 1980s said, well, maybe it'll bounce, and you get this oscillating universe, expanding and contracting for eternity. We now, as you'll see in a moment, believe that that doesn't happen, but nevertheless, that was one option. Second, the one that is popular today, and that is that our universe is a bubble universe amongst many. So if I take some washing up liquid and squirt it into a washing up bowl, I get lots of bubbles, some larger than others. Quantum field produces little bubble universes. Some have the right constants that allow them to expand and become stable. and we happen to be in one which is just right. So we observe it. In other universes, the constants are different, and there are no sustainable universes or intelligent life. And the third is Everett's interpretation of quantum theory, which is quite bizarre, even for late on a Tuesday afternoon, where he says that at every quantum event, the universe splits into two, producing countless, billions of universes, where everything is possible. So there is another universe with me giving this very lecture, just as that door is being closed, a pink elephant walks through it. Everything is possible, because there are an infinite number of universes. Now, if we take this second multiverse, it seems to me that this explanation, acting as a scientific explanation, has a major problem with it. And that is, how do we know that other universes actually exist? Can we pass information from one universe to the other? Now, if we can't pass information from one universe to another, how do we know in scientific terms whether they exist or not? We can still speculate in metaphysical, philosophical terms that there may be other universes. And so one of the critiques of the multiverse as the explanation, scientific explanation of fine-tuning, is actually how do you know that they're there? Now the complication with that is if you need a particular theory of inflation to explain certain properties within our own early universe, and that theory of inflation has the prediction within it of other universes, does that make it a scientific explanation? Now we can talk about that maybe a little later. For what it's worth, I'm not convinced that the multiverse is a good scientific explanation of fine-tuning. I think it's a philosophical option. And therefore, to go back a slide, it is to be judged in the same realm of God did it. However, as I'll come on to, it seems to me that this interpretation, particularly as we take into account the fact that God has revealed himself within the space-time history of the universe, is more preferable. It has some evidence for it, which the multiverse doesn't, of the same order. Fourth, the universe is awe-inspiring. I'm nearly finished, by the way. I do like pretty pictures in astronomy. That's a great thing about being an astronomer. This is the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. Just to whet your appetite for the next 7 days or so, this is New Horizons' picture of Pluto and Sharon and its moon. That's just beautiful. Time-lapse photograph as the spaceship nears Pluto. And 14th of July is when we're going to be right up close. It's terrific. Or, just in the news yesterday, again, forgive me for promoting Durham University, I have to do that because we're far less important than Cambridge University. But this is some observations of galaxy nuclei made with this satellite, the Nuclear Spectroscopic Telescope Array, again by some of my colleagues in the physics department in Durham, showing a number of black holes right at the centre of galaxies. We believe that they've been there for a long time, but by looking at X-rays sent out from the accretion disks, the way that matter falls into black holes, you can begin to identify these supermassive black holes. There's got about 5 of them, they claim. Now, I just love the science. I love the astronomy. I just go, gosh, wow, that we live in this kind of universe. And we can make these kind of observations. And not only are they pretty and beautiful, but actually we can understand what's going on. Again, the sense of awe. Final point. The universe is not eternal. I think this comes into some of our questions of design. Because since 1998, there's been good evidence that the universe, in fact, will expand forever. Saul Perlmutter, Brian Schmidt, and Rice got the Nobel Prize for some of these observations on distant supernova, which showed that the universe was speeding up, it was accelerating in its expansion. The Planck mission, looking at the microwave background radiation, particularly the variations in temperature and polarization, showed that the universe was expanding. It showed us as well that we don't know what most of the universe is made of in terms of dark matter and dark energy. That's another story. The universe will not collapse and bounce. The universe is probably somewhere up here in terms of external expansion. Steven Weinberg, in a famous phrase, said, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. It's interesting in this sense of futility at the end of the universe. Again, there's a question. Well, what is the purpose of the universe? Now, what I've been trying to do in terms of the vastness of the universe, the intelligibility of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the awe-inspiring nature of the universe, the it won't last forever, folks, nature of the universe, it's just to say these pose questions for us. Questions that it seems to me go beyond science, and very interestingly, have been posed by scientists who wouldn't themselves have any faith commitment. It's as if the science is posing these questions. That, I think, is significant. And it's significant because it invites those of us with faith to be part of a conversation. Not to simply take the science and use it in order to prove that God exists, and to smuggle in somehow the nature of God into that. But actually to have an open and honest conversation between science and theology, which allows some of these things to be talked about and some common ground. So back to Temple Chevalier. You thought I might have forgotten about him, didn't you? Well, I haven't. It seems to me that in cosmology, and in some of these areas, conflict is not the dominant narrative of the 21st century in cosmology. Or you will find it in Brian Cox, you'll find it at times in Stephen Hawking, but actually, within the broad swathe of the cosmological community, that is not my experience. There is an openness to a conversation about some of these things. The design is more about wow than about proof. John Hapgood, the former Archbishop of York, himself a research chemist, talked about cool, look at that moments in science. Now, those of you who are scientists will know that most of the time, science isn't about wow. Most of the time, science is frustrating, boring, and tedious. It's about research councils that don't give you the money that you feel you deserve. It's about research students who don't do what you tell them to do. It's about experiments and observations that don't work. It's about referees of papers who don't see the brilliance of your paper and want to include it in your journal and write back with 2 pages of irrelevant comments on your paper. It's about dragging yourself out of bed in the morning, trying to work on this problem that's possessed you for 20 odd years and you're still frustrated by it. That's what most of science is about. But there are those few moments of cool, look at that, or wow, look at that. And as John Polkinghorne has often stressed, a revised natural theology, therefore, which could illuminate us, is about pointers rather than proofs. And that natural theology is interpreted from revealed theology. I'm coming to this subject from a Christian perspective, a structure and a framework of revealed religion, which says I want to therefore interpret some of these questions from the universe from a perspective of belief that God has revealed himself. And therefore, if I engage with you as a scientist, or engage with you as a new atheist, I don't simply want to argue the science in order to convince you that God exists. I want to be open and honest that science is simply a part of this question of is the universe designed? As a theological dimension, which is just as important. Normally they switch the lights off when I've gone over time. This time we've had the lights on. Is that all right, just to start us off on that? Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Now there's a bit of time for questions, discussions for David. Let's start with this thing. Who's got? Oh, you.
I actually just have a quick little comment, and I love that wow. And it occurs to me, speaking as a priest in the community, that when we engage and sort of have that wow moment, we sort of put emotions on God, that God has that wow as well. Sort of like a cheerleader, enthusiastically excited for us to have achieved these, to discover these great goals and sort of achieve these great accomplishments. And it's just to imagine God having a wow and a joy with us is a good thing.
Thank you. That's such an interesting thing. I've not thought about that before. There is a sense in the Genesis narrative, Genesis 1 narrative for me, of that sense that the wow translates into worship. So that it's not about chronology, it's not about science, it's about, wow, Lord, let me get caught up into worship. And therefore I wonder how we work with worship and liturgy in terms of affirming science and the scientists within our congregations. We were talking about this just before the talk. What it means to take that experience of wow and God's affirmation of the gift of science, so that we're a long way from the pagan view of science, which was, you're trespassing in the secrets of God, and God's not pleased with it. Donald Mackay talked about science as a child exploring the father's garden, and as an affirmation from the parent as the child sees that which is beautiful. It's a lovely image, thank you.
Barbara.
So how do you bring together the scientific predictions about the future of the universe and God's promise of a new heaven and a new earth?
Gosh, thank you. And in the 4 hours that we have, Barbara, that's such an important question. And I mean, this sounds really crass to say. I have written something about this, but which is on the books. I'm sorry. I hope it's at a good discount because it's a. And let me just try and summarise one or two important points that if we were to have a longer conversation, I think we'd get into. I think first of all, for me, the central New Testament category about hope for the future is new creation, a transformation of this heaven and earth. Secondly, that it is about transformation rather than recreation. So it's about how God is at work transforming this creation into new creation. Third, the model for me of how that happens and the evidence is about the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. So there is both continuity and discontinuity between the Jesus who died on the cross and the Jesus who was raised. And the transformation will be marked, I think, by continuity and discontinuity. Now then, you and I as physicists will then sit down and talk a bit more of what that continuity and discontinuity might look like in in terms of physics. Might it be, for example, that there are more dimensions to space and time within our experience of new creation? Maybe this creation is a very limited experience of 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. Now we get little hints from the early universe that there are more dimensions than 3 dimensions of space, 1 dimension of time. Might it be that new creation is an opening out of other dimensions? And if that is the case, then one of the things that playing with other dimensions allows us to do is to keep, for instance, time as real, but not as limiting as it is in this creation with its flow. Then, what about the structure of matter? What might be continuity and discontinuity there? Well, it's not going. I'm not going to be made up of the same atoms in new creation that I am now. But is the pattern of how the atoms are patterned within me, might that be different? Might relationality be more important in new creation? Now that's complete speculation, but I think it's really interesting speculation over a cup of coffee tonight, where we could just talk about this. And then I want to ask the question of biologists and geologists about what might it be. And I love that image of C.S. Lewis, that of Shadowlands. Many people think that this world is the full colour real world, and that the world to come is the shadowy grey existence. Lewis said it's completely the other way around. This world is the Shadowlands. The new creation is the more than, more colourful, more real than it is now. And then, as a Christian, I then have to come back and I've got a number of other bullet points, but the final bullet point is, what's the work of the Holy Spirit in all of this? Christian theology talks about transformation and the work of the Holy Spirit in the individual, and often within the human community. But can we think about the work of the Holy Spirit in the world in a way that's transformative to the very physics of the world? I'm sorry, that's not an adequate answer, but those would be the type of issues for us to talk more about.
Well, I think it's great to talk about eschatology. I really like it too. But let me just say one thing about the atoms in your body.
Yes.
You know that none of the atoms in your body are the same as they were even 10 years ago. Every single, in each one of us, we've changed all of our atoms, and yet you're still you.
Yes.
I think we've
I seem to have more atoms now.
Richard was next.
One of the reasons I came on this course, when I read from Polkinghorne, we know that we're inhabitants of an unremarkable planet, circling an unremarkable star, in a universe that contains 10,000 billion stars. I watched the Brian Cox program, and I came away totally despairing.
Yes.
There was nothing, Well, it just, I have depression anyway, but it dropped me into a pit. And I came on this course because I thought, they're bound to have folk like you and others who can actually, I can talk to.
Well, thank you. I mean, the great thing about Faraday is, of course, that it's about having people to talk to. Now, what I keep coming back to, and forgive me for your emphasizing this so often, is that these insights into the universe can be interpreted in different ways. So the vastness of the universe, which poses the question, what are human beings, can be frightening and depressing for some. The silence of the rolling spheres. Deha Zohar has talked about the fear of looking at such a vast universe. For the psalmist in Psalm 8, there's a wonderful movement which goes from what are human beings into the sense that you have created, you have crowned human beings. There's a sense of God's personal creativity at work, which gives us hope, comfort, a sense of love in this vast universe, and that excites me. But I can't. I've got to bring that in from somewhere else. I can't simply go from the science and say, let me show you this scientific equation to tell you that you're loved, or this particular anthropic balance which says that we are the only in the universe, as I'll come on to in the next talk, if you're still all here.
Some of the back, let's move
back. As a theological educator, we can talk some about wow rather than proof in science, but sometimes I think we also miss the wow over proof, or the necessity for wow over proof in theological education as well. I wonder if you might speak something about mystery. And we talked about that a little bit, the lecture about the laws and the open causality and things like that. But I wonder if you might elaborate.
Yeah, thank you. Mystery has become almost as sexy in theology as multiverse has become within the question of design. But it's a very important corrective to particularly approaches to systematic theology and approaches to apologetics, or philosophical theology, which give the impression that God can be fully explained, at least in 10 volumes of any one systematic theology. However, my caution is not to go too far down the mystery track. What's really interesting is the tension within the biblical account, I think, between mystery and revelation, and how the two are held together in a number of places within the biblical witness. And so that means, how that cashes out for me means that I do think that the relationship between theology and worship is very important. And to do our theology within our relationship with worship and a relationship to apologetics or mission. If I was to be very critical of the academy of which I'm part, the Theological Academy these days, in the UK, is the tendency for it to become divorced from the life of worship and divorced from the task of mission. And I think mystery is an important corrective as it leads us into a sense of worship, but also a cautious approach to how we share the good news of Jesus. That actually answering people's questions with the phrase, I don't know, is an entirely valid Christian response. Or actually, we Christians disagree on this issue, is also a valid Christian response. So it's a reminder of our humility, I think, both before God and indeed in our task of mission. But again, a very important question we could talk long and hard about. Thank you.
Roger.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I should say this, but given your title, but does it really add anything to even use the word design as opposed to created or made? I've been down the whole track of the intelligent design movement and the inability of people to distinguish between the allegedly designed and the allegedly non-designed. And so everything from a fundamental particle through a snowflake up to a galaxy, you might as well say is designed. But does it help the bridge building between faith and science to even talk about the concept of design at all?
I've got a lot of sympathy with that. It's an easy get out to say that was the title I was given. But I'm happy to go with that title, with the caution that you express. Caution for me comes not just from the way that the word design is very slippery, very difficult to use. And so people often use the argument of design. Actually, it's not, it's the design argument. You're arguing that design is there. The slipperiness of the word. The second is that it also squeezes God into a particular mold, that of the engineer. Now, if we go back to the first chapter of Genesis again, I do see an order to God's creativity, but I also see the extravagant artist, the one who just flings galaxies, stars, different kinds, here, there, and everywhere. The heavens declare the glory of God is about the divine artist who creates out of extravagance, not simply wanting to produce a nice machine that at the end of the day will produce human beings. Now that means that theologically you want to play with a whole number of different pictures of God. I think if that's done, then a limited use of the word design is important, not least because I think the intelligent design folk beautifully describe it, and sympathy with the view that you have on that. Others will have different views. But they are using the word design, and I think part of our engagement has to be to say, well, actually, what is design all about? And so picking up on this allows us to keep on talking. Thank you.
You were speaking from the Christian point of view. I'm an Orthodox Jew, and I would like to say that this is exactly a Jewish point of view, especially the sentence more about wow than about proof. Maimonides writes that one of the commandments is to love God. And how do you love God? You go out and look at nature and the wonderful thing, and he doesn't use the word wow, but it would be a very good translation. You see his infinite wisdom, and you will come to love God. So it's the same idea that you express. So I also want to thank you for your marvelous talk.
Thank you. And it's interesting how much we are on common ground there. And that intrigues me. And again, it allows us to have conversation together in a way that transcends some of the differences between us. And that's very important. Thank you.
Any last questions? Oh, yes, so there's one before we take a pause. 2 rows back. You have one, so you got one. Just stretch.
We'll take a pause, shall we?
Yeah, firstly, just a comment on the feeling overall when you look at the universe and the fear. I think it's important to remember in Scripture a number of times that when people feel in the presence of God, they feel almost thrown into a pit of fear and trembling. But also, I had some questions about the multiverse as a philosophical option.
Yes.
What would you say about the point that, initially we thought we were the only planet, we thought that was the only sun, and then we found all these other stars, and then we thought we were in a galaxy, and then we found all these other galaxies, and we thought we were the only cluster of galaxies, and then there's all these others. So, I mean, obviously, we're very good at spotting patterns as humans, and it doesn't mean that it will continue, but there is that argument that now we think we're the only universe, so why shouldn't we be that? Unfortunately, I don't know enough about inflationary theory to...
Let me pick up on that, because it's a very important point, and you make it very well. I think and I should have said this, and I was rushing just a little too much in your question, rightly brings me back to say that there is a sense in which we should welcome the multiverse. And I, as a Christian theologian, should welcome the multiverse. First of all, I mean, if there are many, many universes, that doesn't worry me too much. After all, I've already got a universe of 100 billion stars in each of 100 billion galaxies. I'm an astronomer, so a few more orders of magnitude on that is not a big deal. However, the second thing to say is that I think the multiverse is a corrective in the way that you describe, particularly not to resurrect the design argument. Remember, the design argument fell because Darwin said there is a possibility of a different explanation to that which you thought is a designer God. The multiverse acts, I think, in the same way by saying, beware of trying to resurrect that old design argument, because there is a possibility that this could be explained through multiverse on a philosophical level. And I like your sense of, within theistic belief, we don't have to be the center of everything. And actually, that's a good trailer for the next talk, which I'll come on to, if I can pick up a little bit more in that talk. I haven't done justice to it, and you can come back on that.
Thank you, David. That's a good time to pause. Let's thank David again.